Imagine finding out your mother told a friend you were away on a shagging weekend. Now imagine that friend is a convicted pedophile. It feels like an egregious breach of trust, but this is precisely the level of humiliation Princess Eugenie had to endure when 3 million new Epstein files were released last week.
Still, wow, Princess Eugenie's reportedly severed contact with her father, Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, and it's understood she did not pay him a visit at Christmas and is refusing to speak.
What a liar, you know, and his ex-wife Sarah's lying too.
I just can't get my head around taking your teenage daughter to meet the pedo.
Well, they knew him quite well. He'd attended their birthday parties, you know, and it's very sad the way that Beatrice and Eugenie have been dragged into his orbit by their parents.
What if everything you thought you understood about the Epstein scandal was only the surface, and the real story was quietly sitting behind royal doors this entire time? Not whispered, not rumored, documented, buried, protected, and now finally cracking open. Because this isn't just about Prince Andrew anymore. No, that's the version they let you focus on. The convenient villain, the isolated scandal, the one man they could sacrifice to protect something much bigger. But what happens when the spotlight shifts and suddenly the shadows reveal names no one expected to see standing that close? The emails didn't just leak, they detonated. 15 years. That's how long, according to newly exposed documents, money was quietly flowing from Jeffrey Epstein to Sarah Ferguson. Not a one-time favor, not a misunderstanding, a pattern, a lifeline, starting the exact year her marriage collapsed, debts erased, financial pressure lifted, a rescue that didn't come from family, not from the institution, but from a man whose reputation was already dripping with allegations. And if that alone doesn't make you pause, what comes next should. Because buried inside those same communications is something far more disturbing. Not just money, not just influence, access, teenage daughters. Think about that carefully, because according to these revelations, just 5 days after Epstein walked out of prison for sex crimes, Sarah Ferguson wasn't distancing herself. She wasn't protecting her family. She was arranging a meeting, a lunch, a moment that now feels less like coincidence and more like something planned, deliberate, almost normalized. And Meghan Markle, of all people, becomes the unexpected voice pulling this thread into the light. Not an insider you'd expect to break this open. Not someone tied to that earlier timeline. Yet suddenly, she's pointing directly at something that had remained untouched for over a decade. A lunch, a request for flights, first class for the mother, business class for the daughters, paid for by a convicted offender. And the question hits you like a punch you didn't see coming. Why? Why would a mother bring her daughters into that space at that moment with that man unless something deeper was already in motion? Because this doesn't feel like a random mistake. It feels like proximity. Carefully maintained, quietly justified, and protected by something far more powerful than judgment. And once you start asking that question, everything begins to unravel.
Recognizing that they were adults, his daughters, when they got on an airplane with their mother to visit the convicted offender shortly after he was released from jail. A lot of questionable decision-making happening within this family.
Let's rewind, because the version we were given before all of this, it suddenly feels incomplete, almost scripted. The struggling Duchess, financially desperate, embarrassed, cut off, a woman making poor decisions out of survival. That's the narrative that was sold. And maybe parts of it are true, but what if that wasn't the whole picture? What if that version was designed to make everything else easier to ignore? Because while Sarah Ferguson was publicly struggling, her daughters weren't just ordinary young women caught in the fallout. They were royalty, titles that carried weight, names that opened doors, faces that signaled trust. And in the world Epstein operated in, trust wasn't just valuable, it was currency. So when leaked emails suggest that Princess Eugenie, still a teenager at the time, wasn't simply introduced to that world by accident but allegedly brought into it by her own parents, that's when the story shifts from scandal to something far more unsettling. Because now it's not about bad judgment, it's about intention. And if you follow that thread, it leads to a possibility that's hard to even say out loud, that those royal titles weren't just part of their identity, they were part of the appeal, a signal, a shield, a way to make dangerous spaces feel safe. And suddenly, the timeline starts to matter a lot more than anyone realized. July 27th, 2009. Epstein walks free. Not exonerated, not cleared. Released. And what happens next feels almost impossible to explain away.
A few steps, a smile, and a wave to the deputy at the door. We watched Jeffrey Epstein walk out of jail, but only his attorneys heard from him.
He's very happy that his jail sentence is over and he can begin a new chapter in his life.
The last chapter took place behind bars. Epstein served 13 months of an 18-month sentence. Jail time followed court time when last June, Epstein pleaded guilty to procuring a minor for prostitution and solicitation.
5 days later, contact is made. Not cautious, not distant, familiar. What address shall we come to? Not should we, not is it appropriate, just when and where. And then it gets worse because that lunch didn't happen in isolation. It happened in context, a context where a convicted man was already known, where reputations were already stained, where the risk wasn't hidden, it was visible. Yet there they were, sitting across from him, smiling in photographs, sharing space. And afterwards, the tone of those emails changes in a way that's almost impossible to ignore. Gratitude becomes devotion. Politeness becomes something far more personal. I am at your service. Read that again, slowly. A mother writing that to him. What does that even mean? Because those aren't the words of someone keeping distance. Those are the words of someone entangled, deeply, emotionally, maybe even dependently. And then there's the detail that feels so small at first until you realize how disturbing it actually is. A message referencing Eugenie, a casual line about a weekend shared with Epstein. Why would he need to know that? Why would that information be relevant to him? Unless it was. And that's the moment where the questions stop being theoretical and start becoming uncomfortable. Because this isn't about proving crimes. Not yet, not here. There's no direct evidence that those young women did anything wrong. In fact, everything suggests they were navigating a world they didn't build, guided by adults they were supposed to trust. But that doesn't make the situation any less chilling, because what we are looking at is proximity, repeated, documented, explained away for years, and hidden for 16 years. Think about that. 16 years these emails existed, while headlines exploded, while investigations unfolded, while Epstein's name became synonymous with one of the darkest networks in modern history. This part of the story stayed buried. Why? Who decided it wasn't important? Who looked at that paper trail, those lunches, those messages, those connections, and decided the world didn't need to see it? Because that kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. It happens when power protects itself. And if there's one institution that understands the art of controlled silence better than anyone, it's the monarchy. Scandals come and go. Stories rise and disappear. Narratives are shaped, redirected, softened. And through it all, the structure holds. But what happens when the documents refuse to stay hidden? When the emails don't disappear? When the timeline doesn't match the story anymore? That's when things start to break. Because now the focus isn't just on what happened back then, it's on what was kept from us. And more importantly, who made sure it stayed that way? And the most haunting part? The two people at the center of this storm, the ones who were there, who saw, who experienced that world firsthand, have never publicly spoken about it. Not once, not clearly, not completely. Which leaves one question hanging in the air, heavier than everything else. What do they remember? What do they remember? And more importantly, what were they told to forget? Because silence like this doesn't just happen. It's shaped, it's guided, it's reinforced over years until it becomes second nature. And when you grow up inside an institution where image is everything, where perception is carefully managed like a priceless asset, speaking out isn't just difficult, it's dangerous. Not physically, not directly, but reputationally, socially, historically, it can erase you. And that's what makes this next layer so unsettling. Because when you look back at how this entire story unfolded, it's not just about what happened. It's about what didn't happen. The questions that were never asked. The interviews that never took place. The gaps that were quietly accepted as if they didn't matter. Think about it. The Epstein scandal explodes globally in 2019. Names flood the media. Connections are dissected. Survivors come forward with stories that shake the world. And yet, despite all of that noise, all of that scrutiny, these specific emails, this specific lunch, this specific connection involving two royal daughters remains untouched, not debated, not analyzed, untouched. And you have to ask yourself, how is that even possible? Because in any other situation involving any other family, this wouldn't have stayed buried for 16 days, let alone 16 years. But this isn't just any family. This is a system built on continuity, on preservation, on ensuring that no matter what storms hit the surface, the foundation underneath never cracks in public view. And that's where the real tension begins. Because now the foundation is starting to show signs of strain, not from accusations alone, alone, not from speculation, but from documentation, from emails that can be read, words that can't be undone, a timeline that refuses to stay hidden, and suddenly the narrative control that once felt absolute doesn't feel so secure anymore. Because let's go back to that moment again. That lunch, that decision, a convicted man, a mother, 2 young women, 5 days after release. There is no version of that story that feels normal. None. And yet it happened. Not secretly, not quietly hidden in some obscure corner, but openly enough to leave a trail. Emails, requests, gratitude, follow-ups, which means this wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment. It was part of something ongoing. And when you follow that pattern forward, it leads to a much darker realization that proximity wasn't accidental. It was sustained, maintained, possibly even leveraged. Because in Epstein's world, access to power wasn't just useful, it was protective. It created distance between him and scrutiny. It gave him legitimacy. It allowed him to operate in spaces where questions were less likely to be asked. And what could be more legitimizing than sitting beside royalty? A photograph, a meeting, a shared table. That's not just social interaction, that's insulation. And if that's true, then those lunches, those introductions, those moments weren't meaningless. They were valuable, which raises the question no one seems comfortable answering out loud: who benefited from that value? Because yes, Sarah Ferguson's financial struggles were real. Her debts were documented. Her need for assistance wasn't a secret. But when that assistance comes from someone like Epstein, it's never just assistance. There's always an exchange. Always. And the nature of that exchange, that's where things get uncomfortable. Because the emails hint at something deeper than casual gratitude. They suggest a dynamic, a reliance, a willingness to maintain closeness even when every logical instinct should have pushed for distance. I am at your service. Those words don't fade. They echo. And they force you to confront a possibility that feels almost too disturbing to accept, that the lines between help and obligation may have blurred completely. Now pause for a second, because it's important to say this clearly. There is still no direct evidence that Princess Eugenie or Princess Beatrice committed any wrongdoing. None. And that distinction matters. But proximity to power, especially dangerous power, comes with consequences whether you choose it or inherit it. And that's the position they were placed in. Not by strangers, by their own family. And that's what makes this story so difficult to process. Because it's not just about scandal, it's about responsibility, about protection, about the role of parents in shielding their children from harm, and what happens when that protection fails. Or worse, when it's never fully there to begin with. Because when a mother introduces her daughters to a man with a known history, the question isn't just why. It's what did she believe would happen next? Was it denial? Was it desperation? Or was it something more calculated? And that's where the speculation starts to creep in. Quietly at first, then louder, then impossible to ignore. Because if these emails had surfaced earlier, if this connection had been publicly examined when the world first learned about Epstein's network, would things have unfolded differently? Would more questions have been asked? Would more protections have been put in place? Would more victims have been heard sooner? We can't answer that. Narratives, history itself, and maybe, just maybe, the people who were once seen as untouchable will finally have to face something they've avoided for far too long. Not speculation, not rumor, but accountability. And until that moment comes, the question remains not what happened, but who knew and why they stayed silent.